Gary, I've just turned it on. Go ahead.
Welcome everybody to our Ellensburg train trip today. And today we're going to be talking about the economic aspects of passenger rail service through Central Washington. We know now that it's technically and operationally feasible. So there's a lot of questions about where do we go from here and so forth. So that's kind of our subject matter for today. To start things off, I'm going to introduce Professor John Bowen, who is a professor of geography at Central Washington University, who has studied this particular route in the past and is going to give us a little bit of background about the route itself. Professor Bowen.
All right, thank you all very much. Can you hear me okay?
Just fine.
All right, great. Well, thank you for the opportunity. My background is actually in transportation geography, but especially aviation. I used to work in the airline industry in Singapore a long time ago, and I've done a lot of research on aviation. Rail transportation is not really my expertise, but I have enjoyed being part of this project, and I want to thank All Aboard Washington for helping to create this opportunity for me, and especially for the students that you see listed at the bottom of this title slide. Most notably, Noah Westbay, who was a research assistant for me on this project during the summer of 2017 through the kind funding provided by All Aboard Washington. But quite a few students were involved in this project. So just by way of introduction, the Stampede Pass corridor is an approximately 230-mile long stretch of rail line linking Pasco in Washington's Tri-Cities area to Auburn in the Seattle metropolitan area. For nearly a century, the line was a vital artery for passenger transportation. From the time of the first, if you could go back a slide. I'll just say when I want the slides to be advanced, if that's okay. So for nearly a century, the line was a vital artery for passenger transportation from the time of the first Northern Pacific trains on this route in 1887 until the last Amtrak train passed through on October 26, 1981. Since that time, there's been interest among the communities along this corridor and among other stakeholders in restoring scheduled passenger train service. Much has changed in the nearly 4 decades since the service ended, and what was once not economically viable might be feasible now. All Aboard Washington has led the way in pushing for careful consideration of restoring scheduled service on this corridor. And as part of that effort in 2016, All Aboard Washington asked me to work at, and I should say Lloyd Flem in particular, I'm really grateful to Lloyd for reaching out to me. Lloyd and All Aboard Washington more generally asked me to work with students to explore the restoration of services. So in this presentation, I want to briefly provide some background on the corridor and the work I did with students in 2016 and 2017, which will then lead into the perspective of a current CW student, Edgar Espino, and then later on some discussion of more recent work done on this corridor. Here you can see the Stampede Pass corridor in its geographic context. The red line is owned by the Burlington Northern and Santa Fe Railroad and is used, at least east of Auburn, is used exclusively for freight transportation. Traffic is light. In 2010, there were 6 trains per day versus an estimated capacity of 39 trains per day. More recently, in the 2019 State Rail Plan, this sector was given a level of service grade of B, indicating that it continues to operate well below capacity. The map on the screen highlights how the resumption of passenger services on this route would provide a vital link in the state's passenger rail network. Notably, Yakima is the largest metro area in the state of Washington without intercity rail service. And now if I could have the next slide. All right, so here you see a satellite image from Google Earth showing the position of the Stampede Pass tunnel. You can also see I-90 traversing Snoqualmie Pass at the top of the image, about 11 miles northwest of the Stampede Pass tunnel. Alleviating congestion on I-90 is, of course, one rationale for resuming passenger rail service along this corridor. Next slide, please. Let me share just a little of the history of this route. The Northern Pacific completed the line over Stampede Pass using a series of switchbacks on either side in 1887, making this the 5th independent transcontinental railroad after the Union Pacific, Southern Pacific, Denver and Rio Grande, and the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad. Next slide. A year later, the first trains went through the Stampede Pass tunnel. Stampede Pass has an elevation of 3,671 feet. Stampede Pass tunnel has an elevation of 2,827 feet. So the tunnel saves 850 vertical feet. In the same year that the tunnel opened, the bridge over the Columbia River at Pasco was completed. Next slide. In the conversations before this train track started, some people were talking about the North Coast Limited. So here's an advertisement for that service. In 1900, the Northern Pacific's North Coast Limited began operating from Seattle to Chicago via the Stampede Pass. And by 1902, it was a year-round daily service. A challenge for the Northern Pacific early on was the very small populations in the counties through which it passed. Altogether, King, Kittitas, Yakima, Benton, and Franklin counties had only 133,000 people in 1900. But the railroad helped to spur population and economic growth, and by 1950, the same counties had 1 million people. Next slide. In fact, Northern Pacific depots became dynamos of economic activity in the communities served, including here in Ellensburg. Unfortunately, by the mid-20th century, I should say, railroads in the United States were being eclipsed by aviation for long-distance passenger transportation and by cars and trucks for short-distance passenger transportation. By 1957, airlines in the United States were carrying more people than traveled in luxury Pullman and coach class rail services combined. And the railroad share of intercity freight traffic also fell from about 72% in 1943 to less than 40% in 1970. As the railroad share of traffic fell, the industry consolidated. In 1970, the Northern Pacific merged with 3 other rail lines to create Burlington Northern. A year later, the merged railroad ended the last North Coast Limited. Passenger services resumed a few weeks later, however, as the newly created Amtrak, as shown in the lower right, initiated its empire builder over much the same service. Next slide. But then in 1981, the alignment of the empire builder was shifted farther north in Washington over the old Great Northern Line through Wenatchee and the Cascade Tunnel. The last, as I mentioned before, the last regularly scheduled passenger train passed through the communities of the Stampede Pass corridor on October 6, 1981. For more than a decade, from 1983 until 1996, there was no regular passenger or freight traffic over the Stampede Pass corridor. But then with the gigantic increase in trans-Pacific trade, especially trans-Pacific containerized trade with China and other commercial factors, the line was rehabilitated for freight traffic, and the Stampede Pass corridor became what it is today, a relatively lightly used link in Burlington Northern and Santa Fe's network. The key limitation for Burlington Northern and Santa Fe is that the Stampede Pass tunnel is currently too short to permit the passage of double-stacked containers. Next slide. But we are here to talk about passenger transportation, not freight transportation. So what are the prospects for resurrecting passenger rail services through this corridor? There have been several studies that have looked at that question. I'll talk about 2 of the studies, and then some other people on this train trek webinar will talk about the more recent steer group study later this afternoon. So first, in 2001, the Washington State Department of Transportation undertook a study of the feasibility of restoring east-west passenger rail services in Washington focusing on the Stampede Pass corridor. It did not estimate demand in any way, and it did not determine if the service would be financially practical. But the study did conclude that it was technically doable, though it would require at least 16 miles of new track or sidings to allow trains to pass each other. It would require a new system of centralized train control between Auburn and Pasco, improved grade crossings, and new train equipment. Altogether, the estimated cost of restoring the service to kind of technical feasibility was $350 million in 2001, which is approximately $500 to $600 million today, adjusting for inflation. Next slide. The 2001 study concluded with a tone of pessimism, saying it would take many years to make the east-west passenger rail service a reality, and that pessimism has been at least partly self-fulfilling. Next slide. However, in the years since then, traffic volumes on the highways paralleling the Stampede Pass corridor have continued to climb. They have in fact grown almost threefold. Getting some of this traffic off highways and into train cars could alleviate some of the congestion. In summer, for example, traffic congestion on I-90 frequently reaches punishing levels, with motorists, including trucks, diverting onto narrow rural roads paralleling the highway, such as the Nelson Siding Road in Easton. Next slide. The resumption of scheduled rail passenger services could also alleviate some of the strain on the system in winter when there are frequently extended closures of I-90 due to avalanche control and accidents. This past year was better, but that's really only because of the pandemic and the steep reduction in travel. Next slide. Another potential source of demand for the Stampede Pass corridor is long distance commuters. And you can, actually the little boxes kind of moved up when this was resaved. So actually it's the Kittitas row that I'd like you to look at. And what you can see is that in the census data from 2011 to 2015, about 1,200 people per week were commuting from a home in Kittitas County to work in King County. Obviously, the schedule for any rail service and the precise locations of stations would not work well for all of these commuters, but it might work well for some of them, providing a base level of demand. Next slide. We could also think about the complementarity of Eastern and Western Washington in terms of other forces that could generate traffic flow. For instance, the major sporting events in Seattle outside of this pandemic year draw people from a large hinterland across Washington state, including many communities along the Stampede Pass corridor. Next slide. On this side of the mountains, ski resorts, wineries, Central Washington University are all significant potential traffic generators, and they've all become more significant since that 2001 study was done. The university where I work, for example, CW, is much larger than it was in 2001. And I think if you could hit the next, if you could advance the next slide. Yeah, so just to show you where students at CW come from, you can see King County is the top source, and some of that traffic could take the form of rail passengers. Next slide. All right, so it is with these sorts of considerations in mind that my students and I undertook a study of potential demand for rail transportation on the Stampede Pass rail corridor. And so I'd like to use the balance of my time to briefly talk about our methodology and our results. Next slide. So the study was completed in two stages. First, my students worked in teams to conduct a pilot study of our survey through face-to-face interviews at a supermarket here in Ellensburg. The survey included questions about how often residents had ridden trains before, how often they would hypothetically ride the train if service were restored on the Stampede Pass corridor, as well as questions about demographics, such as age, income, ethnicity, and other attributes of our respondents. Altogether, we interviewed almost 100 people at the supermarket and then used the results to refine our survey. And for the most part, the survey was distributed electronically via Central Washington University's subscription to a service called Qualtrics. We promoted the survey in newspaper articles, in interviews, on radio and TV, and via social media. In distributing the survey, we encouraged anyone, regardless of their support for restored services, to complete the questionnaire. And we kept the survey deliberately brief, with a completion time of under 5 minutes, to encourage as many people as possible to do the survey. And as you can see, over about 6 months, more than 2,700 surveys were completed this way. Next slide. Here you can see the communities that from which our survey results came, and the sizes of the place names are proportional to the number of responses. So we had by far the greatest responses from Ellensburg and Yakima. That makes sense given that the survey was based at CWU. But we also had representation from across Washington, including the Tri-Cities, Prosser, Sunnyside, Cle Elum, and many other places across the state. Next slide. Most of our responses had little experience with intercity train travel. Almost 70% had not taken a trip by train in the preceding year. Not surprisingly, the most common trip among those who had traveled by train was between Portland and Seattle. Next slide. Despite the respondents' overall lack of experience with train travel, they were generally very enthusiastic to see scheduled passenger trains return to the Stampede Pass corridor. And this result is echoed by the more recent STEER study, which also found a very strong level of support for resuming services. Respondents throughout the corridor viewed the resumption of scheduled trains as important, with Yakima having the highest value overall. Auburn and Pasco, which already have scheduled train services, logically did not attach as much importance to the Stampede Pass corridor. Next slide. So in each community, we asked questions about how often a respondent could envision taking the train. And for the sake of time, I'll just share with you the results for Ellensburg. We presented each person with a scenario with estimated travel times and fares. We based these parameters on the existing Empire Builder service, existing Amtrak Empire Builder service. So these are not numbers from nowhere, but I should say that the travel time we stated for our respondents is shorter than the travel times in the recent STEER group study. For instance, we estimated a travel time of 2 hours and 50 minutes between Ellensburg and Seattle. The STEER group study estimated a travel time between these two cities of 3 hours and 50 minutes. And as may be discussed later in this Train Track webinar, the STEER group study includes an estimated travel time between Cle Elum and Auburn, an estimated speed of the train between Auburn and Cle Elum of 26 miles per hour. So they envisioned a very slow train. So our study had in mind a sort of faster service, and that might have conditioned our results. As far as fares are concerned, we estimated $21 for the lowest fare between Ellensburg and Seattle, which is not far off from the $24 stated in the STEER study. The respondents to this survey were informed that the Stampede Pass corridor's terminus in Auburn would connect to the north-south line there, including to Seattle, and that the terminus in Pasco would connect to the east-west line there, including Amtrak service to Portland and Spokane. Next slide. And I have just a few more slides. So with these parameters in mind, what did we find? Our respondents in Ellensburg estimated a median of 6 trips per year to Seattle by train. Only 8% said they would not use it. Of course, there might be some self-selection bias in terms of who responded to the survey, but as I said earlier, we tried to make this survey as accessible as possible to encourage as wide a participation as possible. Let me go on to the next slide. As for eastbound traffic, and again, I'm just showing you the Ellensburg results for the sake of time, our respondents estimated 1 trip per year. And almost 40% said they would not use the service in that direction. Overall, however, our results found strong support up and down the Stampede Pass corridor for bringing back the train. One interesting result I'd like to share is that among ethnic groups, non-white respondents generally predicted higher usage of restored passenger rail services than non-Hispanic white respondents. In particular, Hispanic respondents forecast about twice as many trips in both directions as white non-Hispanic respondents. This result is partly attributable to the fact that Hispanics were disproportionately numerous in the Yakima survey, which had the strongest support for the idea of bringing back the train overall. But even within the Yakima subsample, Hispanics had a higher predicted number of trips in both directions than non-Hispanic whites. Okay, I think I've more or less used up my time, so if you could go to the last slide. So I'd like to say thank you. Again, thank you to All Aboard Washington for inviting me and especially for creating an opportunity for my students to be involved in this project. The full report from our work is available along with the other studies that will be discussed today at All Aboard Washington's website. Just look for the page called East West. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Appreciate that background. A little more still staying in Ellensburg to give us a flavor of what passenger rail might do to benefit Central Washington University. I'd like to introduce Edgar Espino. Edgar is the Director for Government Affairs for the Associated Students of Central Washington University. So Edgar, you're muted, Ed. There you go.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I think this can definitely benefit students because as we see, just connecting east to the east side of the west side, and showed from the study as well that a good chunk of students who attend Central Washington University are from the west side, from major cities, maybe like Seattle, Everett, Sammamish, Tacoma, as well as tiny bit Olympia, and as well from the east side too, specifically around the Tri-City area. So just having the Stampede rail just going around there, it brings travel equity because not all students have access to a car. Then, like, for example, I don't have a car at the moment, so what I've been doing is I've been renting through the university, but if I had the option to ride a train, I would definitely be taking that option. So I think just in general, it brings more unity towards the state of Washington. It allows students to travel more for more educational sources, and just in general, it's more travel equity, more options for students to travel around the state to get an education.
Thank you, Edgar. Questions, anybody so far? Okay, now we're going to move on to the economic aspects of the route. And to kick this off, I'd like to introduce Mr. Jim Matthews. Jim is the President and CEO of Rail Passengers Association, and he joins us this afternoon from Washington, D.C. Jim.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for having me. And, you know, I know so many of you on this call. It's great to see so many familiar faces, even if you're postage stamp size on a screen. You know, when I see who's here, you know, I wonder, what can I possibly add to this conversation that you guys don't already know? Next slide, please. I think what I'd like to do is to focus on kind of the bigger picture legislatively. You know, you've had a bunch of studies now. Obviously, the most recent study just came out a little bit ago. There was some good things in there, but also some disappointing things in there. And I sense that when I talk to some advocates, there's a little bit of deflation based on that. And I got to tell you, don't do that. Don't feel that way one bit. You still have a compelling case. And a lot of what we're going to do today is go over that compelling case. And when you have a compelling case in this environment, you have a halfway decent chance of success. Where we are right now, we were this way even before coronavirus, and it's only picked up now more intensely. Republicans and Democrats in the Congress right now agree that we have to do some kind of infrastructure program. There are competing trillion-dollar programs out there. They, even before coronavirus and the idea of fiscal stimulus came along, the idea was out there that we needed to catch up on decades of underinvestment in infrastructure. The only question was whether it was the Republicans' plan that was going to come to the top or the Democrats' plan or some blend of the two. All the folks who tried to run for president the past few months also have advanced infrastructure proposals. So there's going to be an infrastructure bill. The question is just how much and when. Moreover, you do have a compelling case, this not only for this route that we're talking about today, but you can see examples of how this works in Washington State already and all around the country. So the question really is, will you be ready in Washington when the dam breaks? Somebody's program is going to pass. And if you are organized and you have an authority or a government agency or a program ready to kind of be a catcher's mitt and catch that funding and be ready to go, you're going to be in a good place. Next slide, please. We all know, or we wouldn't be here on a Saturday, that trains deliver value to the served communities. What a lot of folks don't know is that they deliver value 6 or 7 or even more times the dollars that you invest in the service. And we hear this over and over again, and we heard it when the STEER study came out. You know, you read the newspaper, you read the coverage, and people talk about how, well, this isn't going to make money. The route isn't going to be profitable. We have got to break that conversation, and you are in a position to do that in Washington. It's not about whether a route is profitable to the operator. The profit goes to the communities. And that's not just a slogan. We can prove that mathematically. If you look at the restoration of the service in the Gulf Coast that was wiped out after Katrina, we're just going to get started with a segment between Mobile and New Orleans. Just that segment is going to cost maybe $5 to $7 million a year to operate, and it's going to return $171 million to the economies along that route in the 3 states every single year. That's an incredible return. The important conversation, and you have to have that conversation in Washington State today, is you are talking about tax-paying citizens collecting the return on equity for their federal dollars that are invested. Don't get hung up on route profitability, and don't let people who oppose it use that as the cudgel to beat this service. There's a lot of this working today, and you can point to it and prove it. So I hope to give you a little bit of ammunition this afternoon. Next slide, please. So let's start here. This is the one you hear all the time. Well, trains only make sense in big cities. I know my friend, Mr. Christensen, is on the call, or he was. I saw his little postage stamp. Mike put this map together for us a little while back, and I use it endlessly because it makes the point. When people talk about trains being only relevant to cities, what they see in their mind's eye is the map that you see on the left, where you have these giant blue dots around large urban centers and very little usage outside of those urban centers. But that's when you just count ridership per train as a raw number. What you need to do instead is look at the number of riders per departure. You have to make it, you have to make that adjustment for when you have 10 trains or 16 trains versus 1 train in each direction every day, or even fewer trains in the case of like the Sunset or the Cardinal. And when you make that adjustment, you get a map that looks like what you see here on the right. This is a picture of a network that is well used all across the country. And some of those larger dots or blobs, you'll notice, are in smaller towns and rural communities all across the country. Don't let anybody tell you that trains are only for connecting urban centers. That map on the right shows you that that's just not true. Next step, please. So we're going to go through very quickly some examples that you can pull out and use. Next slide. This is one of my favorites, Virginia. I say this as a guy who's lived in Virginia for 20 some odd years. But Virginia made the commitment to really invest. And look at how this has turned out for them. $1.4 billion in economic returns to the Commonwealth of Virginia, $390 million in new tourist spending. And I hate to use this word, but if you got to use it for certain opponents, go ahead and pull it out. This service is profitable above the rail, meaning if you take the capital costs out and you just look at the operating, the Virginia service is profitable above the rail. Was $17.58 per passenger in 2018. Why is that? Because it takes traffic off the road, because it gives people an opportunity in Virginia to get where they have to go without having to be on Virginia's crowded highways. And speaking as a Virginia resident for many years, I can tell you, the traffic in and around, particularly metropolitan Washington, is legendarily bad. This has proven to be a tremendous service. And just look at Charlottesville, where University of Virginia is. Students are going back and forth to Charlottesville. And the problem in Charlottesville is that there's so much usage that the platform is no longer safe. That it's so narrow at that Charlottesville station. All the students are crowded onto the platform, and they need a new station. They need a new facility because they can't handle all the traffic that comes to Charlottesville. It's a very well-used service, and it's doing very, very well for the state. And they want to add more service, and the state is in negotiations to do that right now. Next slide, please. The Downeaster. I'm sure most of the folks here on this call know the story of the birth of the Downeaster. And it really was the vision of a handful of folks in Maine, led by our dear friend, I can't help it, Wayne from Maine. Tremendous support locally. And what you have now is 5 daily round trips between Portland and Boston, setting coronavirus aside, because those frequencies have been cut somewhat from that. More than 500,000 riders every single year, and that's more than double since they started the service in 2005. 100 people directly employed on this service, but the service brings 100,000 annual visitors to Maine. And those folks coming to Maine, they get off the train, they empty their wallets, they go to the stores, they go to the restaurants, they go to the bars, they go to the hotels, they go to the Airbnbs, and they leave behind dollars. And because they leave behind dollars, they support waiters and waitresses and hotel owners and restaurateurs and bar owners, and it just ripples out. And so, yes, Barry, Wayne Davis, indeed. I didn't want to shortchange him, but I can't help it. I always call him Wayne from Maine. I love him to death. And more importantly, this route has become a catalyst to attract private capital. One of the examples in the Portland station, they're calling it Thompson's Point, $105 million in private capital in development just around that station program. So this is a growth engine for that region, and it extends that growth northward from the Boston Metro. Next slide, please. So the Hiawatha, this links Wisconsin and Illinois, and they are just climbing all over themselves to try to add frequencies on this route. They want to get up to 10 frequencies. Right now they're at 7, and they're coming up close to 1 million passengers. There are businesses along the line that run their own private shuttle to and from the Hiawatha. And that is primarily because they have a workforce that they can now reach out farther to get folks to come work at their facilities, because they have the ability to take that train to and from work. S.C. Johnson Wax is a big booster of this train, for example, and that's because they can bring the workforce in on the Hiawatha. It's growing tremendously, about 6% a year. It grows along with the population. So as more folks move in, they take the train. So this has been another example of how it's not about whether the route itself makes money. It's about who it makes money for. And it's always been a giant return to the communities. And if it weren't, you wouldn't have the businesses fighting to add frequencies to this service. Next slide, please. So Virginia, Maine, Wisconsin, and Washington, just look around your own state, are already leveraging these federal benefits. So why not go out and get more? Next slide. So this is kind of a fun ad, and it's something that I suspect that the current Amtrak management might be disappointed to learn that we went out and found. This was from an Amtrak timetable not too many years ago, and it was Amtrak pointing out the multiplier effect that running service has in the communities it serves all across America. But this is an important point, and it's one to bring up whenever you can confront the folks who oppose these services. It's the towns and cities that are served that collect the profit, not Amtrak. Amtrak itself, this is almost 10 years ago, estimated that they contributed $7.4 billion to the US economy. And what you see here is Weidman's restaurant in Meridian, Mississippi. We all know the story of Meridian, where John Robert Smith was once the mayor, and then he became the chairman of Amtrak. I've been there. I've been to that restaurant, and it's the whole area around the Meridian station is a poster child for the kinds of economic development that you can inject into a community by having this train service. And so we spend very roughly, taking coronavirus out of the equation, we spend very roughly $1.8, $1.9 billion a year to have an Amtrak. And right now, our best estimate as an association is that that generates around $8.5 billion for the economy overall. That's a pretty good deal for the American taxpayer. Next slide, please. So I'm sorry this is so small, but I think that you guys are all going to be able to get these slides afterwards. So I'm hoping that this is something you can just refer to later. But if you look at, we recently did a study to support my testimony before the US House of Representatives about 2 weeks ago now. And for the purposes of the study, we looked at just a few of the routes at the City of New Orleans, the Empire Builder, the Silver Services, which Amtrak has combined for the time being, the Southwest Chief, the Texas Eagle, and the Crescent. And when we looked at those routes just by themselves, we came up with very roughly $2.4 billion or so of economic benefits to the states, to the communities that are served. And if you look at the 12 long distance routes that Amtrak operates today daily, that comes out to almost $4.8 billion. We excluded the auto train, and we excluded the Sunset, and we excluded the Cardinal from this analysis. We wanted to look at what daily service contributes, and that's what it contributes. As you all probably know, Amtrak is looking to save money because of coronavirus and claiming that they can do this by cutting service back on these daily long distance trains to 3 times a week. We think that's a bad idea. We recognize that Amtrak needs to respond to the coronavirus. We're not naive, but we think there's a better way to do it. We think shorter consist is one answer. And we think asking Congress to support the service is the other answer, because Congress has demonstrated a willingness to support this service and get it through these tough times, just like they're going to do for the airlines, just like they've done for a lot of other businesses. They recognize, both Republicans and Democrats, that this is an essential service in these communities. How do we know? Because the ridership on these trains has held up more than any other part of the system. So if it hadn't held up, then maybe you'd have a case. But folks took these trains when they were available. Remember the map I showed you at the beginning. We're seeing that play out even in the coronavirus. Next slide, please. So this is what happens when you take those daily services and you cut them back to 3 times a week. We're saying that for 9 months, which is what Amtrak says they're going to do, they claim they're going to restore the service after a 9-month period. If you do that, even if you get through that 9 months, you're going to cause very roughly $2.4 billion of damage to the 30 states that are served by these routes today. You're going to get over $3 billion if that extends any longer than 9 months, and we think it probably will. So this is just going to be a disaster. $3 billion if this goes on for a year, at least $2.4 billion on communities that can afford it the least. And we have essentially now 13 days, 12 days to stop it. That's a tall order. Next slide, please. I would be remiss if I didn't take an opportunity to ask all of you, while you're thinking about the long term and thinking about getting this service started or restored really in Washington State, we need to have an Amtrak for it to connect to. And if we don't solve this problem in the next couple of weeks, we're not going to have a network to connect to. And that's going to really damage the financials of the proposed new route that you guys are fighting so hard for. So I'm urging all of you to please help us with this. Please go to our website. It's very, very confusingly called railpassengers.org/save-trains. Not too tough to remember. Please do that. When you get there, you'll see a couple of tools, and I urge you to use all of them. We have all gathered together on that page some resources for you to use, some posts that we've written in advance that you can put on your Twitter or a Facebook page. We have graphics that you can share on your Facebook or Instagram pages if you have them. We have a link to a tool that allows you to send a message to your members of Congress. You can customize that message. You don't have to, but if you want to, you're free to, and we encourage you to do that. And we have a tool that lets you make a phone call. It even gives you a script. So if you're not sure what to say or how to say it, we have a script on there that allows you to make that call to Congress. And just like you can with the emails, you can modify that script to make it more like you. But all those tools are there. Please go to the page. Please take part. The clock is ticking. We're at 12 days and counting. And we need every single person on this call to take action, fix this, preserve our network so that when the network is preserved, we can then start connecting the route that we're talking about today through Washington to the rest of the national network and really make it worth doing. So I believe that's all I've got here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Any questions for Jim? Okay, hearing none, we're going to now expand on the economic benefits that Jim was talking about there, specifically as they relate to the Stampede Pass route. And to do that, I'm going to introduce Abe Zumwalt, who is a board member of All Aboard Washington and a transportation analyst for R.L. Banks and Associates. Abe, take it away.
Just unmuting myself there. Can everybody hear me okay?
Just fine.
Great. How much time do I have, Gary? I know that this is going to be kind of a reduced version of the presentation.
Oh, you've got, I think, probably plenty of time. We've got 25 minutes here.
Oh, okay. Then never mind. That's quite comfortable. Great. So I think that several people on the call have seen the numbers I'm going to run through before, but I know that there are some newcomers, and so I'm going to be sure to make the benefits that we believe east-west passenger rail service in Washington State will bring. So again, my name is Abe Zumwalt, and my day job is I'm an associate at the nation's oldest railroad consulting firm, R.L. Banks and Associates. We do some strange work that few other firms do, things like negotiating access to Class I railroads on behalf of shippers and municipalities in the interest of expanding transit service. And we also produced an influential study calculating the benefits of the Empire Builder in Montana, some elements from which I'm borrowing today. I'd also be remiss to mention that before I was an analyst at R.L. Banks, I worked for several years at the Rail Passengers Association under Jim Matthews, and I'm really glad that he could join us today to give us a picture of the macro view of passenger rail service today, the best of times in the sense that there's a real political coalition building behind improving passenger rail service, and the worst of times given the sense that Amtrak is really looking at doing something pretty disastrous to the national rail network, upon which both east-west service will rely upon, but also what our own Cascade service relies upon, given the fact that the Coast Starlight provides an extra frequency in each direction. And that's actually a component of what I'm going to talk about in just towards the end of this presentation. So let's go to the next slide. And I see it's just, and the one after that, please. So when Steer published their report several months back, they contemplated around 200,000 passengers taking this new corridor between Seattle and Spokane. They only looked at a couple of trains a day, so of course ridership is limited to around 200,000. And so let's look at what that means. What did an extra 200,000 people taking a train from east to west via Yakima mean? And really, from our initial investigation, we're looking at pretty good numbers. For about $15 million for one train or $30 million for two trains in their estimates, we would get a savings of around $33 million from car trips diverted. We're looking at perhaps an extra $7 million in visitor spending, several $100,000 in pollution saved, and $8 million that Washingtonians would no longer have to shell out for airfare. And this adds up pretty big. It more than pays for itself. Let's go to the next slide, please. One interesting thing about the Steer report is that it really only considered diverted automotive trips. This means that every single one of those 200,000 riders that they project taking the train would only come from cars. That would be the only source of ridership that they contemplated. And much like fish and water, general American transportation policy has largely spoken from quote unquote behind the wheel of a car, and therefore does not really appreciate how terrifically expensive driving is. There's a vast amount of research that would allow for a more in-depth analysis of how saving Washingtonians from unnecessary vehicle miles traveled would benefit the state in myriad ways. But for expediency, we'll use an average figure developed by some of our respected neighbors to the north at the Victoria Policy Institute. Next slide, please. So overall, based on some numbers that the American Association of Highway and Transportation Officials from their bottom line report, they estimate that if U.S. annual vehicle travel grows at 1.4% annually, we have to spend $144 billion for roadway expansion, repair, and maintenance. But if vehicle travel only grows 1% annually, required expenditures decline to $120 billion. So this suggests that 0.5% growth in vehicle travel, which totals around 12 billion annual vehicle miles, causes $24 billion in annual congestion and road maintenance costs. And that translates to about $2 for every vehicle mile traveled. That means that if you drive your car one less mile on a road, you've just saved the highway apparatus maintaining and building new roads $2. Really quite steep. We added that to an extremely conservative estimation of costs incurred from the tens of thousands of fatalities that occur every year on American roads at 12 cents. A lot of studies price it far higher. And also, on top of that, if drivers switch to a train, carbon emissions are slashed roughly in half. So that's quite a bit already, and we're just scratching the surface. Furthermore, if we go to the next slide, what's really interesting is that the state has actually acknowledged vehicle miles traveled importance in state law. We have a goal. This year, we were to drop vehicle miles traveled by 18% in Washington state. By 2035, it's to be 30%, and by 2050, it's to be 50%. Now, are we going to follow these goals? I would argue that adherence to the rail program is a strong indicator of whether we will or whether we won't. Vehicle mile travel reduction goals are really logistical objectives. What alternatives will be made available to ensure that people can do this without compromising their livelihoods and their own pursuits of happiness? Next slide, please. So how did we actually calculate these numbers? The Steer report only reported the the number of passengers on East-West Rail in a gross number. We were really lucky, however, that they also provided this map of origin destination points from an independent survey that it conducted. Each one of these percentage points represents a trip that their own survey for the report contemplated between two different points on the Seattle-Spokane corridor. This means that we could take the gross ridership number and multiply it against the backdrop of these percentages to come to what we believe ridership would look like at a given origin destination pair. If you go to the next slide, please. This means that in Ellensburg, if you look at the top Ellensburg on the x-axis and go down, you'll see that about 19,000 people would travel to Ellensburg in a given year with only one train a day operating. So you can see the total over there in the far right-hand corner, lower right-hand corner, at 191,000 passengers. So about 10% of ridership would end up in Ellensburg. That's great, actually. If we then go to the next slide, we did some simple math where we took the ridership pair and then we multiplied it by the national vehicle occupancy at 1.67. We then multiplied that against the trip miles for the fastest Google driving maps mileage. And then we multiplied that by the saved vehicle maintenance, vehicle miles traveled maintenance and safety costs. And you can see that the state overall saves with just one train a day, $33 million, more than $33 million actually, in saved road maintenance and emergency responses to fatalities. That's enough to pay for the entire service alone. And you'll notice that in Ellensburg, again, that number is around $196 or $200,000 really. Of course, with more service, these savings would increase, but just as a start, it's pretty heartening to see some of this. However, I think it's important for us to go to the next slide and make a consideration. Next slide, please. Next slide after that. Steer's ridership estimates were derived solely from car trips avoided. Now, this doesn't reflect Amtrak's own data regarding ridership in Washington State. Next slide. According to Amtrak's own data, about half of the passengers would drive. About a third of them would fly. Only 10% would take a bus instead, and 11%, which is to say more than the passengers that would be taking a bus, wouldn't travel at all. And this tells us several interesting things. First of all, it tells us that the Steer estimate of ridership is perhaps underestimated by as much as half. I don't know if it's that extreme, but it's really valuable to note that Steer's estimation of what a rail passenger looks like in Washington State is far different from Amtrak's measurement of that reality. There's clearly room, therefore, to question the idea that ridership would only come from would-be car trips. If you go to the next slide, really importantly out of this is the fact that passengers who would not travel, which is a funny thing to say, but it's a true effect, is a significant portion. And Washington State beats the national average by several points. Over 10% of the passengers traveling on trains wouldn't be traveling without the trains there. As with all consumer choices, there are myriad reasons as to why this is, but it does speak to the unique quality of train travel. Note again, and I can't repeat this more often enough, but these trains are just not interchangeable with buses. Furthermore, these particular passengers are extremely valuable. You go to the next slide. According to Experience Washington, which is our state's tourism bureau, each one of those passengers that are making a day trip is worth on average $84. Each one of those passengers making an overnight trip is worth $366. And these are not averages for Seattle. These are averages over the entire state. So if we go to the next slide, we conducted an exercise where we took the Steer ridership schedules, which don't allow for day trips, and we contemplated that if the Steer ridership numbers conformed to the Amtrak data and 11% of their gross figures were induced, one train a day in this exercise would be capable of creating almost $8 million in induced visitor spending. Note for Ellensburg that this is about, again, about $200,000 or $500,000 if you if you go the other direction. And then let's go to the next slide. Not only does it make money for these communities, but it also saves everybody traveling. A full third of Amtrak passengers in Washington State would otherwise fly. Well, those passengers are otherwise spending about 47 cents per mile to buy those tickets. Amtrak's average Amtrak Cascades fare is around 25 to 26 cents per mile. And so those third of the passengers are saving a tremendous amount of money. It adds up fast. If you go to the next slide, East-West service with just one train a day would save the Washingtonians using it over $8 million. And especially, I think, for populations in the middle of the state, that money is very meaningful. Now, it has to be acknowledged that the Steer report anticipated exactly no diversion from airlines to prospective rail service, given the extreme time savings. However, given the historic Cascades performance against hourly Horizon air flights throughout the entirety of its corridor, managing to derive a third of its ridership from them as per Amtrak's numbers, despite fewer departures and far longer journey time, it isn't really a futile exercise to contemplate this. The only assumption we're making is that passengers on the East-West service aren't making drastically different choices than those made by present passengers on Washington's intercity passenger rail system, several thousand of which already originate from Eastern Washington. Especially to the Tri-Cities from Spokane, where the projected train service would actually be faster, this measurement of utility is a boon to Washington State residents and representative of a far different policy than exists today, which can be summed up thusly. Please go to the next slide. You know, I really love that slide presented by Professor Bowen talking about snow closures over the Cascade Mountains, because right now transportation policy in Washington State, a supposedly progressive, forward-looking state, is this: if you can't afford plane tickets, then you'd better get on your knees and put some tire chains on. It's a really brutal mentality, and it isn't the future we want. We need to work to change it. If you go to the next slide, please. That reality makes it no surprise that Steer cited the 76% support rating that it found for East-West trains as one of the highest rates of public support that they'd ever seen in any sort of community engagement they've done. The outpouring of support for this service is remarkable, especially given the otherwise divided results of our recent state primary. For the price of a few miles of highway, and more about that at the very end of this presentation, we could have a 400-mile corridor connecting the entire state. This high level of support may come as a surprise, but it really shouldn't be. So moving on to the next slide, please. I think it's valuable to include this. By the same limited analysis I subjected Steer's ridership to for East-West service, it should be noted that the Cascades paid out big. Overall, if we apply the same metrics, the Cascades saved the state over almost $55 million in road maintenance. We saved $1.6 million in reduced visitor fatalities, about $1 million in pollution, almost $18 million in airfare saved, and almost $14 million in visitor spending. If you extrapolate that over the ridership of the route over the years, next slide, please, you can see that even though 2019 was a banner year for the Cascades has reliably carried about 800,000 passengers like a clock over the last 6 years. And this means that over this period of time, the Cascades made the state almost $500 million in investment, which is not at all the amount of money that the state has itself invested. It's also a generous rate of return for the good amount of federal money that has gone into the state corridor in this time. However, there's a flip side to this, which is the fact that Cascades ridership seems to be kind of hitting a ceiling here. You can see that we're bouncing up against just a little over 800,000 people routinely, and we're never seeing any actual interesting sustained growth. And I want to talk about this for a moment. It's a very important takeaway. You can go to the next slide. If you leave this presentation with only one concept, apart from Jim Matthews' very good urge to go ahead and get onto the rail passenger site and call your senators about Amtrak reducing service, because it's related to what I'm going to talk about here. make it this concept. The frequency of passenger rail service is exponentially related to ridership. This means that for each train added, ridership on all trains in a given corridor see growth, and this results in higher average passenger loads. This is something that customers already understand intuitively. If trains run often enough to not consult a schedule, as in there's one every 15 minutes on a light rail line or every hour in the case of the California services on this chart towards the top of that curve, the utility of the service drastically increases. As frequency grows, the cost of operations also enjoy greater efficiencies over a larger number of trips. And this results in a virtuous cycle of more passengers and shrinking cost per passenger carried. It seems as if the Cascades was capped at 800,000 riders, that's because it actually was. And this effect also cuts both ways. Don't expect the one Cascades frequency now running in the midst of the pandemic to provide a strong indication of demand returning. Ridership will neither shrink nor grow geometrically. Service will have to be added as a part of the process of restoring convenience and service. On this chart, you'll see squarely in the middle a point labeled for the Amtrak Cascade service. The 2006 plan for the Cascade service anticipated that we would be where the Pacific Surfliner is in this chart, at 13 daily frequencies and nearly 3 million riders. Please note that the Cascades is at the base of a very steep climb on this curve. I would argue that it has been at a level of frequency just under what the bare minimum of offering service throughout a given day would be. 4 round trips to Portland has garnered a modicum of success, but 7, as should have been running were it not for the derailment of train 501 in 2017, would have had trains running almost every 2 hours on a given day. And the data points to the fact that there would have been more than a commensurate increase in ridership. In relation to the east-west ridership, please note the group of trains at the bottom of the curve. Running between only 1 and 2 daily frequencies, they are exactly in line with the ridership projected in the STEER report at around 200,000 riders a day. More ambitious service over the mountains to the growing Tri-Cities, the largest population center near the West Coast without a direct connection to the national rail network, will almost certainly deliver much bigger ridership numbers. Please note that this effect was ignored when considering the fact that the potential east-west service adds a new dimension of rail service at Auburn, Washington. And amazingly, in the STEER report, it was ignored because, quote, it already had sounder service. But from documenting this effect, we know that an increase in building upon present service should garner more ridership still. That's not how passenger rail corridors work. What Amtrak is effectively doing in its reduction of service from all the long distance routes, and so in Washington State, it's the Empire Builder and the Coast Starlight, they run between 1 train a day and 3 trains a day. They're gonna move down this curve if we run a train once per day or 3 times per week. You really undercut the utility. So moving on to the next slide. 2023, as per the 2006 plan, we were supposed to be seeing almost 3 million riders and 13 daily frequencies. And on to the next slide. That would have produced, and it should be producing, around $300 million in benefits every year. And that really also adds up quickly. So I want you to go to the next slide, please. And the next slide after that. Finally, to wrap up punctually here, or at least close to punctually, I think it's really important to take aim directly at the sort of subsidies we are often competing against and how much more you can buy. For the STEER report contemplated that the east-west passenger rail service capital costs to, strengthen the rail service, buy equipment, all of that is somewhere between 280 and 380 million. And that's for the entire 400-mile corridor from Spokane, dipping down into the Tri-Cities and over to Seattle. Right now, the state is presently spending, in the current budget crunch, $220 million on 2 miles of HOV lanes just north of Tacoma. They're spending $283 million on about 6 miles of lanes over Snoqualmie Pass, the very pass that east-west service would strengthen by providing a real alternative when those passes get dangerous in the wintertime. These sorts of perspective, it has to be nailed in all the time. that when people talk about the great cost of passenger rail corridors, if you stack it up to any kind of highway investment, it quickly becomes apparent that we're really not talking about a lot of money. With that, I should cede the floor, but thank you so much for trying to bring Jim's great points into local perspective.
Thank you, Abe. Appreciate that. We have a few minutes here just for questions or comments if anybody has any. I have one for Jim Matthews. Jim, we've been hearing a lot about the Southern Rail Commission. And one of the questions that I have is, in view of your familiarity with the history of that organization, if we were to set up a similar commission here in the Pacific Northwest, is there anything that you think should be done differently? I mean, does it work well, or is there some way it could be improved?
I think the Southern Rail Commission model is a tremendously valuable model. If I had my way, the magic fairy came, tapped me on the head, said I could have whatever I want, I would clone the Southern Rail Commission all over the country. And we would have a Northwest Rail Commission. We would have a Southeast Rail Commission. We would have a Mid-Atlantic Rail Commission. It's a very solid mechanism. It does a lot of good things. For one thing, it creates a framework for going after federal programs. It also creates a framework for bringing local policy, local transportation policy into the shaping of whatever service emerges. It gives an appropriate level of buy-in. And so the thing you got to be careful with is it is a political body, and you could potentially, with the wrong governor, you could create a lot of mischief because the governor in this structure, the governor appoints the members of the commission. And so you would have to be, you'd probably want to write in some language around that. But overall, I think the Southern Rail Commission has just proven to be incredibly valuable in helping us to finally, for example, get some movement on restoring the service in the Gulf Coast after Katrina wiped out the service. It's kind of funny to me. People look at that and say, "Oh, it's taken so long." Well, yes, it has. But without the Southern Rail Commission, I think there's a fairly good chance that it wouldn't have happened at all. So I do think it's a very, very solid way to go.
Is there anything that you're aware of that would prevent us from establishing a Northwest Rail Commission? I mean, the Southern Rail Commission is kind of a one of a kind, right?
It is, but all the mechanisms are in place. The legal precedent's in place, the framework's in place. It's been done before, clearly. So there's a way to do it that's pretty straightforward. It, like everything, it becomes a political question. You would need to get the states collectively to agree that it's a good idea. You would need the governors of each state to sign off. You need the congressional delegations of each state to agree that, hey, yes, this is something we want to create and fund. Because remember, the Southern Rail Commission gets funding for operating. It's not enormous, but it does get some funding to conduct its activities. Moreover, it is eligible to receive funds that are grant funds for establishing services, but that's a separate issue. All of that means that you need to have the governors and the congressional delegations all on the same page. And you need to decide, which states, how far does this want to go? What is the Northwest in your minds? And you may discover, is Northern California plausibly part of a Northwest Rail Commission? I don't know. I think you can make a case for probably the first 100 miles, right? But you can't have a partial, the state's either in or it's out. So you'd have to sort of think that through. What does that look like? How far east do you go? I think, would you create perhaps instead of a Northwest Rail Commission, a Mountain West Rail Commission, so that you could really loop in the energy that we're seeing now in Montana and North Dakota. That's a possibility. All of those are political questions because you'd have to get the governors in each of those states to sign up to it and to fight for that within the Congress to get it set up. So it's not a slam dunk. But I think when you start showing numbers like Abe has showed us today, you know, the economic case is so compelling. And this is why we made an investment at the Rail Passengers Association in 2018 in the modeling tools to do this, because the economic case is so compelling that you can start to have conversations around creating a rail commission, around creating new grant programs, because the payoff is visible. And when you can really push back on, you know, this idea that, you know, we'll spend $70 million a mile on highways and not even blink an eye. When you can do that, you can set up commissions because now you have the factual data behind you. And when you add the politics and the facts together, I think that makes a lot of good things happen. So I could not be a stronger supporter of the work that has to be done to create some kind of commission. And I would just start looking at politically what it takes to do that and where the natural sort of allies are, whether that wants to go more to the east or more to the south.
Thanks for that, Jim.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else have questions for Jim, or anybody else for that matter that's any of our speakers?
Well, I have a comment I'd like to make in response to Professor Bowen's presentation. When I was going to college in the late 50s, I would make 3 round trips a year between Chicago and Minneapolis. And parenthetically, I could choose 3 different trains, either the Burlington Zephyr, the Milwaukee Road Hiawatha, or the Northwestern 400. And when I was in graduate school, I would take the 20th Century Limited for 2 round trips a year. So at least back then, when one went to college, that was really the predominant way of traveling. I mean, the college I went to, you were not allowed to have a car. So you essentially had to take a train or a bus to get there. Thank you.
I would just say quickly, thank you for sharing that story. I think college students are a good market for rail travel, as Edgar mentioned in his comments earlier. One thing that's worth noting in that regard is that young people today, in general, are waiting longer to get a driver's license. The average age of getting a driver's license has increased. Having a car at many campuses is very expensive. Parking can be very expensive. So I think it is a good market even today for rail travel, and potentially here in the Stampede Pass corridor. So thank you again for sharing that story.
And Edgar, so we talked a couple days ago about your situation, given the fact that on the one hand, a lot of the classes at Central are being conducted online, and yet on the other hand, there's still a lot of activity on campus. And you told me about what you're doing with the student government. I bet everyone would really be interested to hear what you have to go through as a student in this sort of situation.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, with COVID happening, and then you have all the smoke, basically a lot of environmental issues and the pandemic. It's made my job kind of difficult. So I would usually, if like in an ideal world where there's no pandemic, I would actually be living in Ellensburg doing all classes in person. But since we have a pandemic, that can't really work. So what I've been doing so far is I've been renting a car through the university. They rent through Enterprise, and I would drive myself from Olympia to Ellensburg. But I also do realize that not everyone has that luxury to do that. What I'm doing basically is a privilege. And just because I work with student government, I have that privilege, but not everyone has that. So if a train was available, what I could theoretically do is I can drive myself either to Tacoma, and then I could take the Sound Transit train from Tacoma to Seattle, and then take the train, the theoretical Stampede train from Seattle to Ellensburg. That would be pretty easy.
Yeah, because they've I live in Thurston County as well. So yeah, they've shut off the bus service to Tacoma as a result of the pandemic. So unfortunately, we don't have that direct link, but you could still you know, either you could pop on, like you said, you can drive up to Tacoma or something. So at least then with that train, you would have an option. But right now you're forced to do that. What is that, a 3, almost 4-ish hour drive?
It's 2.5 hours. It's quite a long drive
Okay.
still.
Yeah. Every 2 weeks. Yeah. It's got to be crazy.
It is. I mean, it's still good work. It needs to get done as well. You can only do so much virtually.
Can I just add a quick observation alongside? And I'm going to put my friend and former colleague Abe on the spot here. But when we talk about cars and driving and so forth, I'm having a memory that isn't every parking spot $18,000 of subsidy?
So that was work by this really great economist working out of Los Angeles, of all places. Maybe more logical to come out of Los Angeles than anywhere else, given how much of it's parking lot. But this guy named Donald Shoup, S-H-O-U-P, and he's really worth looking into. And I believe that $18,000 was actually an estimation from the 90s. And now, especially given the growing density of every city on the West Coast, including Los Angeles, the average number has grown to over $30,000 a parking spot because so much of it is now underground. Because while there are parking easements in places like Seattle's been fairly good about getting rid of some parking requirements, there are still a lot of high-rises going up, and they got to build those gigantic basement parking garages. And so the overall subsidy has actually gotten more expensive than it used to be.
So think about that, guys. When we talk about when the naysayers on trains say, "Well, we're subsidizing, $10 a passenger or something like that." Well, how about $30,000 a parking spot every time you drive your car?
And let's talk Puget Sound. I'm looking. There's something from the Seattle Transit blog. Somebody did an analysis with our sounder system. The cost is getting even higher than that. I think somebody did an estimate of $160,000 for each of the 505 net new stalls added by the parking garage in Sumner alone. They're also going to do other garages. So just think about that. In the Puget Sound, it's even more than that. Do we really want to pay $160,000 per stall?
Yeah.
I mean, and Edgar and Abe and I are going to be the ones footing the bill for that.
All right, thank you, everybody. We've got a couple more things to cover here. So our next item that we're going to talk about is rail districts, which are here in Washington. There is such a thing. And we're going to have Mr. Louis Musso, who's a member of All Aboard Washington, speak to us on that as a potential funding source. Louis.
Thank you, Gary. Greetings from, actually, for the first time in a while, sunny Cle Elum. I just want to bring to your attention a tool that some of you are aware we have, some of you are not aware that we have, and that is in the Revised Code of Washington, RCW 36.60, county rail districts. Very briefly, the background here, in the early 1980s, the Milwaukee Road, which was in its terminal gyrations, was abandoning freight track all over the Palouse, primarily in this state. And not all areas were willing to create port districts, which would be the normal alternative, to take over those tracks. So the state authorized counties to create, by vote of the people, and without the necessity of a tax, county freight rail districts, which would be headed by the county commissioners, so there was no new bureaucracy or no new elected officials, to be able to operate those freight tracks. None were created, although it passed, none were created, and the statute just sat there in the RCW books for about 20 years. In 2000, what became the Suncadia Resort, which was then Trend West, got interested in building a resort here in Cle Elum, which in fact has been built and has been very successful. And one of the things they were interested in at that time was being able to connect what they saw as their market in Puget Sound with the facility in Cle Elum by rail. I was brought in as a consultant, literally stumbled over that bill, and working with All Aboard Washington at that time. It was under a different name, but it was still Lloyd Fleming, and I hope he's listening today. Very helpful, and also the lobbyists that Trend West had. We were able to add to that bill authorization to do the same thing for passenger rail service. In other words, converting what had been only for rail service into rail and or passenger. Passed almost unanimously, state legislature. Governor at the time signed it. We have a lovely picture, and I still have the pen. But it required creation by the county. That took place in 2007. After considerable discussion, really more a question of educating the community and making the then county commissioners, and there were several sets of county commissioners in that period of time, all good people and all people who eventually came on board, that this was not a threat in the sense of creating some new layer of government, and that it was not a threat in creating some new taxing district. Kittitas County is one of those counties that's turned down a port district multiple times and would have turned down, and I have no argument with it, would have turned down a rail district if it also had a new command structure and a new tax base. So 2007, the voters of the county create the state's first passenger rail district. Now, what happened in 2007 immediately afterward? The Great Recession. Companies like Suncadia were not in a position to put up the kind of money they had anticipated in order to support the development of rail service. So basically things sat, but the tool was ready to be used. As we were sitting at the end of the last legislative session, a number of us on this call were sitting in the old state library that's now the lobbyists' haven. And in March, we were outlining among the things that needed to be done was I needed to get with the new county commissioners in Kittitas County, bring this to their attention, get their sign off, because they have not been officially brought on board since the three new commissioners have been seated. And what happened as soon as we left Olympia? Everything shut down. So that hasn't been done yet, but that is the highest priority in my mind, is talking to our local county commissioners about the opportunities they have, should they wish to use them, to facilitate the very things we've been talking about. It's much like Mr. Matthews mentioned with respect to the Rail Commission. It's a useful tool and it accomplishes some useful things, but it's not something you want to just run wild. There are a number of other aspects that would involve some changes, some fine tuning of the legislation But again, that's beyond where we need to talk today. I just want you all to know that you'll be hearing about 3660, and it is a tool that we have that could be exceptionally useful in carrying out what we've been discussing. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. And with us today, we have Kittitas County Commissioner Corey Wright. And Corey, you might want to follow up on what Louis said, or otherwise provide us with what you think passenger rail could do for Kittitas County.
Yeah, thank you. And I apologize. I don't know if my video is working.
It is. It's fine.
Good. Well, then you get casual me, because I just jumped off the tractor for this. I apologize. I was really planning on more on listening today. But just so everyone knows, I am the District 1 Commissioner for Kittitas County. I have been in since about since 2018. And Steve Hayden, who has been probably the largest benefactor and active force in the restoration of the Northern Pacific Depot here in Ellensburg, got me hooked up here with Lloyd and all aboard Washington. So passenger rail would be a tremendous impact, both economically and, of course, on our transportation corridor. We, as someone who personally spent the better part of 6 years driving back and forth to Seattle, I worked in the maritime industry. I am very well aware of the hazards and the travails of the I-90 corridor. And with our growth in Kittitas County, not only prior to this year, but the exponential growth, which is showing in our housing inventory pressures right now, as folks are finding that they have the ability to live where they recreate now that they can telecommute due to COVID. So the county is definitely interested in getting rail service going again. I think from a first step, the acquisition of the Northern Pacific Depot as a public building is something that is of prime importance. I've previously read the legislative study that was put out with some fairly depressing news just recently, and one of the highlights was the lack of infrastructure on this side of the mountain. We have a turnkey, ready to go, beautifully restored depot here, which needs to be put to public use. And for the first time, the county has hired a federal lobbyist. This is something that we had not done in the past. We recognize this year that we need to start getting tuned up at that level locally, and we've already had discussions on transportation infrastructure bills and how that building may figure in to future plans. So we just need a plan for it. Of course, right now it's not all. It wouldn't all be used for transportation. We have pressing needs, frankly, at a local level, just for a regional transportation hub, not only for our intercity buses, but also for regional buses. So starting the transformation of that building into a intermodal hub will preserve that for future rail use, which is our ultimate goal for that, as well as how the excess space would be used. We have a wonderful record in this county of buying something with not really a plan for it. I don't want to repeat that, but there is a lot of potential for that building. And that's all I really have today. I'm a newcomer here, but I really appreciate the efforts that have been put forth. I know this has been a long road for this group, and I thank you for hanging in there. This is a big game changer for our area.
Thank you, Commissioner Wright, and we may be calling on you to support us as we move through this a little further, go through our next step. In case some of you are not aware, that depot that's in the picture behind Patrick is the restored Ellensburg depot that was restored by, it's privately owned by Steve Hayden, an Ellensburg resident. But what's a little bit humorous here is the recent steer study included $24 million for a new depot at Ellensburg. So that gives you an idea. If it hasn't been mentioned, but 2 trains a day between Seattle and Spokane, the total infrastructure cost is $420 million, according to Steer. And I believe there are 4 depots like that, and they pegged all 4 of them at $24 million. And so we're kind of the belief it can be done for less than that, but that's the way it is.
Gary, if I could just clarify one thing. Steve is not the private owner of the depot. It's actually owned by a nonprofit, the Friends of the Northern Pacific Depot, which is a 501c3 and has a board of directors and all that sort of thing. Steve is certainly due 99.9% of the credit that it's gotten as far as it has, but it would be inaccurate for people to think that he was the owner of the building.
Thank you for that correction, Louis. It's also, I lost my train of thought there, what I was going to say about that depot, but any rate, let's see, I think we're about due to run out of time here pretty soon. So let's move on to our next steps and what we think we can do or what should be done and maybe how you can help. And for that, I'd like to introduce Charlie Hamilton. Charlie is our All Aboard Washington Communications coordinator. And Charlie, if you'd like to
Thank you. Thank you, Gary. I've got one slide. It's a real simple one. This was put together a couple of days ago for those of you who were involved in the Montana event, which was really exciting. There's a lot of excitement over there. But they asked a very specific question. They said, if you want to make something happen in terms of rail advocacy, how do you do it? And the question I answered this way is like, we've got to get people involved. This is something that we all know, but I thought it wouldn't hurt to have it all in one place. So if you think about all of your friends who fall into these categories, if you could get 10 of your friends to be partner with you in becoming members of All Aboard Washington or members of Rail Passengers Association or whatever local groups that you're going to have in your part of the world, this is really, as Jim Matthews said earlier, it's really about getting people involved. And I won't list why all of these people belong in that category because it's pretty obvious. But as Edgar said earlier, you know, there are people who don't want to have to be driving over the mountains in the winter when the snow is flying. So think about who you know that falls in these categories. And if you can't find 10 people who you can bring to part of this process, I'd be very surprised.
Thank you, Charlie. Questions, anybody? If not, we'll move on to Luis Miscoso. Luis is former co-vice chair of the Washington State House Transportation Committee, and he's a co-founder of the Legislative Rail Caucus, and he is also the Government Affairs Director for All Aboard Washington. So Luis is going to provide our closing comments. Luis.
Thank you, Gary. And thanks everybody for participating today and for the great conversation we've had. It's become clear from my perspective that the work that we're doing now at All Aboard is really pushing this item to the fore. And what we have to recognize going forward is that All Aboard Washington is also an overwhelmingly volunteer organization. We do not have the kind of staff to do some of the deeper work we'd like to do. But organizing to get something done is why we're here today and why we're going to take these train treks across Eastern Washington to find out who else can help us. So as you can see from this slide, this is from our mission statement. Next slide, please. And our goal, of course, is we've got to get passage of funding for the Amtrak Cascades, not just for the, first of all, to start the research on the Stampede Pass corridor. Next slide, please. As I pointed out, this is a volunteer organization, and we're right there at the grassroots, along with other rail advocacy organizations in the Northwest like Aorta, and even a new one we understand is starting in Montana now that they have caught the bug and want to get intercity passenger rail working for them. Next slide, please. So from grassroots in organizing, talking to our friends, we've got to get to the people, sort of the movers and shakers who really need to understand the benefits that you saw earlier in all the presentations about how passenger rail is a tool for revenue and business success. Next slide, please. And there are municipal regional planning groups at this time, city and county governments that have some work done already with passenger rail, but we don't have folks in those situations that are advocating that. It was wonderful to hear the Council Commissioner Wright talk about his support for this and how people at that level of government really have to get their arms around this to take it to the next level. The next slide. So it's back to the state government again. How do we get these bills and provisos in place through the work of the Transportation Commission, WSDOT, of course, everyone agreeing that we have not spent enough time taking care of our mission here with the Cascades. Next slide. And as you've also seen today, at the point where we can use federal support as well as the Rail Commission, which is looking at a larger interstate network, we have to work at all these levels. We're a volunteer organization. We could use all the help we can to contact that, especially by having folks in each of our legislative and congressional districts know what to say to their legislator or congressman. We'll provide that information for you if you can please let us know that you can help us get the word out and advocate with us in Olympia and Washington. Is there another slide? Okay, this speaks for itself. You've heard this all day, and we need to make sure that being a friend of passenger rail, that you're ready to get behind us. And also, I think I should have said this earlier, Washington State has made a commitment to passenger rail over 30 years ago, and we've forgotten what that commitment has been. It's time to make sure that our legislators today understand that the commitment to have a Cascades network to Eastern Washington was made, and now we have to live up to it. Thank you. Somebody's muted.
We'll throw in one more thing. We have a number of the updated events, these train tracks. There are 3 more coming. There will be one more in the Tri-Cities in October. There will be one in Cle Elum in November. And there will be an Auburn event in December. That one will also be the wrap up, where we'll pull together all the information that we have learned between the various train treks that we've done. So please, you're welcome to tell your friends to join us. They're all different, and we'd love to have you participate in all of the future events. So please join us. We think it's an exciting fall.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Good to have you. We're going to sign off now.
Thank you very much for joining us. Like Charlie said, we have some upcoming events that we hope you can participate in. Feel free to visit our website, aawa.us/east-west. We look forward to seeing you at the next event.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.